the homelessness, since I seem to be the only person interested in discussing the plight of the homeless. So, as you may know, a lot of Republicans in the US, and I'm going to focus on Republicans and the US today, but I'd like to preface talking about this by saying that homelessness and the bad treatment that the homeless have to endure, the dehumanization of homeless people, is not a topic that is exactly US centric. It's not a topic that is exclusive to the US, is what I'm trying to say. But since the US is sort of among, if not the most powerful country, it is extremely influential, and I believe that certain negative um, certain negative solutions that the US adapts or wants to adapt, striving to adapt, might sooner or later be adapted outside of the US, because people might look at it and say, the US adapted this law. Maybe it has a point. Maybe we could be adopting a similar law. And in this case, we are discussing pushing forward a law that would forbid homeless people from creating encampments in the city in certain areas, or maybe even all areas. And you can see why that's a problem, right? Like, especially in the absence of any alternatives, you can see why that would be a problem, why that would basically mean that the very existence of the homeless would become something that is against the law. Like, homeless people sort of trying to prepare for themselves a place to sleep in, a place to weather the storms in. And of course, it's not by no means a perfect solution. Like, those places can be sort of raided. Those places are not safe from other people coming in and stealing items, things, possessions of the homeless. Those things are not exactly. It's not a perfect. It's not a good solution, right? Homeless people just camping out in tents, but it is a sort of way for homeless people to exist. And sort of politicians in certain areas of the US argue that they have a solution to it. The solution is to ban these encampments from being erected in the first place. But a certain court, sort of regional court, has judged that actually, in the face of lack of any alternatives, it should not be allowed to just ban homeless people from creating those encampments. That is actually bad. That it is actually a bad thing to do. A court has actually ruled um, justly, right? And this, of course, sparks a discussion by the lawmakers in the cities and towns that argue that such a ruling that blocks the law that would forbid homeless people from camping in tents, that law makes it quote unquote impossible to deal with the problem of encampment. And what this tells me, right? I even took notes. I took a little bit of a note in my little notebook for this comment. My note. Bullshit. It made it impossible to sweep the problem under the rug by choosing to by chasing the homeless people away and pretending that the problem does not even exist. Because what do people mean when they say solving the problem, addressing growing incumbents problem? What do they mean when they say addressing? They mean chasing the people away. While in reality, addressing the problem would mean addressing the underlying problems that caused the people to be homeless to begin with, uh, trying to do something about the fact that the homeless have no housing, probably trying to address the problem of not having any source of income, probably also trying to address the emergent mental, psychological slash emotional issues that sort of um, become a problem in homelessness, increasingly so the longer one is homeless. But that is not exactly what the people that push for this law have in mind. Like they don't care about any of that. They don't actually care about solving any of these issues, about actually addressing the problems. But what they do care about is chasing the people away from public view. Out of sight, out of mind. We have an article. We're going to read it. We're going to read the article and we're going to. The article actually says a lot of the things that I've just said, but I'm sure the article will say it in a way smarter way. So we're going to read it. We're going to read it. We're going to read it because we love reading. I love reading. Supreme Court to consider. And of course, since like the more regional court has deemed this sort of thing to be unacceptable, the thing is being brought to a Supreme Court, to the Supreme Court, I suppose. Supreme Court to consider whether cities can ticket homeless people. And where the article is going to get into the absurdity of just how much the fine is. The Supreme Court is set to hear oral arguments Monday, which is today, so it's happening today, over a challenge to a law letting cities fine homeless people, potentially radically changing the lives of the hundreds of thousands without homes. Let that sink in, by the way. The US, that is the most strongest, the most richest country, hundreds of thousands of homeless people. I'm pretty sure that should be unacceptable in a country that considers itself a success. It should be unacceptable. Hundreds of thousands of homeless. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that cities cannot ticket homeless people for camping in public when there were no alternative shelters available. Though the municipalities backing the suit want that opinion overturned, Well, that is usually what happens. Homeless people are being pushed out because that is like this sort of solution to the problem, quote unquote. The city and town officials argue that the restrictions prevent them from implementing common sense, quote unquote, laws against camping in certain public places. And I must admit, the term common sense is doing a lot of work here. The term common sense laws, like common sense for whom? Whom are these laws serving? They are, of course, serving to push the problem out of public's eye, to shove it away, to get rid of it. Common sense laws against camping in certain public places. While homeless advocates say an overturn could effectively criminalize homeless people existing, which of course is the goal of the people that push for these sort of laws. That is actually the goal, to criminalize homeless people's existence. That has always been the goal. That is the goal of, for example, not providing enough public bathrooms combined with fining people for doing their business in public. It is always the same pattern. It is always the same pattern of not providing resources for the homeless to exist, while on the other hand, criminalizing the only means that are left for them to exist. It's a vicious sort of thing, especially since the end goal in the case of all of these laws is not to get a fine out of a homeless person. No, the end goal is of course jail, because if a homeless person is fined, and the sums, the fine amounts are usually ridiculous, most homeless people will not be able to pay the fine. Well, the next step is to take them to jail because they cannot they cannot pay the fine, which means that effectively it fills the jails and it gets rid of the visible problem. It gets the visible problem of the streets. Perfect. Perfect. The suit is led by the city of Grants Pass, or which implemented an anti-camping law that would fine homeless people $295 per night. So again, if this law would come to pass and would spread, homeless people for camping would be fined with $295 per each night. Yes, so imagine a homeless person camping out for 7 nights. 7 times 295. Like, which homeless person will be able to pay such a fine? Who? Who will be able to pay such a fine? No one. No homeless person will be able to pay this fine. Which is, of course, which is the whole point. That is the whole point. To make a fine that is ridiculous, unpayable, and the next logical step, as I've said before, is jail. Out of sight, out of mind. Homeless people get swept off the streets, put to jail, problem solved, right? Problem solved. Not to mention how it probably feeds into the whole strange US private prison business sector. I suppose that probably also creates like that is also part of it. Because from I understand, the prison system is in the U.S. is run like a business. There are quotas of prisoners that there are quotas of prisoners that need to be met. There are I just that's a whole thing on its own, which just astounds. It astounds me how this whole thing functions. The town's attorney said blocking the law has made it impossible for cities to address growing encampments. And again, we have to ask ourselves time and time and time again, what does addressing growing encampments mean? What is the addressing? Like, and we know the answer. It is not addressing the real underlying problems that homeless people face. It is not addressing the root causes that caused the homeless to become homeless in the first place. It does not seek to better their situation. It does not seek to provide mental, psychological assistance, assistance in getting a source of income, assistance in getting housing that is not a tent. No, none of these things. No, none of these things are included in addressing growing encampments. Why do I say this? Because blocking the law that would forbid homeless people from camping, blocking that law would not stand in the way of addressing these things. It would not stand in the way of trying to get homeless people psychological help, of trying to get a source of income for homeless people. It would not stand in the way of trying to get more permanent housing for homeless people. It would stand in the way of none of that. But do you know what it stands in the way of? That's right. It stands in the way of simply getting rid of homeless people, of just getting rid of those encampments. That is what the town's attorney means when they say that blocking the law has made it impossible for cities to address growing encampments, because apparently the only way cities know how to address these problems is to simply get rid of the encampments, and the problem, quote unquote, is solved. It's solved. Just push them away. Push them out. They can go somewhere else. Get and they're unsafe, unhealthy, and problematic for everyone. That is very telling. That is a very amped description of how homeless people in general are viewed. Unsafe, unhealthy, problematic for everyone. Like once someone becomes homeless, a person becomes, well, I'm gonna say it, basically barely human. Barely human, unsafe, unhealthy, problematic. Their existence is all these things, especially those who are experiencing homelessness. Lawyer Thane Evangelis told the Associated Press. That is rich. The homeless people are unsafe, unhealthy, and problematic, especially to themselves. And therefore, we should not allow them to exist in public spaces because they're just too problematic to themselves. And what a holistic, what a really deep and systemic way to tackle this issue. What a way to really, really solve the problem. Perfect, perfect. Rates of homelessness are at a record high levels as housing prices continue to soar. Homelessness is most common on the West Coast, where more expensive rent costs and milder temperatures make going without housing more likely, which the article here sort of names a few issues that causes homelessness. So this sort of thing needs more systemic, like affordable housing schemes, or maybe looking at how much people earn and sort of analyzing that there might be a problem there, right? Like trying to look at the issues, trying to look at what causes homelessness to be at a record high level. Like you cannot just look at more and more people becoming homeless and conclude, oh, more and more people are just becoming barely citizens that are not worthy of consideration, that just need to be cleaned out, pushed out, that just need to be taken care of by not allowing them to exist in public because they are once again unsafe, unhealthy, and problematic. Like, that is not a solution to this multifaceted, complicated problem. And I do understand that it is multifaceted and complicated, but the solution is definitely not pushing for a law like this. There are about 650,000 homeless people in the country, according to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, with about a third of them living on the West Coast. And I will, I assume, I'm not sure, there's this annual way of counting up homeless people which has its own problems. I don't remember the exact name of this thing. Thank you for the subscription, Mojika. Thank you for the subscription. So I don't remember the specific technical name for the annual counting up of the number of homeless people that happens in the US each year, but I do know, what I do know is that it has a lot of problems. Any type of trying to assess how many homeless people there are will probably be an undercount. There will be probably many homeless people that will not be taken into consideration during these counts. So I assume, and bear in mind, this will be an assumption on my case. I'm making a personal judgment, an assumption that there are probably a lot more than 650,000 homeless people in the US. I will sort of make this speculative judgment on my part that this is probably undercounted. And not because the undercount is done on purpose, it's because the methods of counting homeless people are, by their very nature, imperfect. There is no perfect way to count how many homeless people there are. Like, as an example, the annual thing that happens usually somewhere near February happens when there are a lot of homeless people that, for example, take their savings and rent a few days in a hotel or any sort of place that is warm where they can wash themselves, etc. And a homeless person that rents such a place for even just a few days is no longer counted as homeless in these sort of things. Homeless people that are not visible, obviously, in public view are not always counted. There are many people that sort of slip through the cracks in these sort of counting methods, and it's nothing that is done on sort of a lot of that is not done on purpose. It's not necessarily a malicious process, but it does result in an undercount of the actual number of homeless people in a country, in this case in the US. So, as I've said, we can probably assume that there's more than 650,000 homeless. The argument of the case centers on the Eighth Amendment, with homeless advocates arguing that ticketing people without homes qualifies as cruel and unusual punishment. And yeah, and so I'm gonna agree with the homeless advocates on this one. It is actually cruel and unusual punishment. It punishes people for trying to exist, for trying to make do with their situation. Yeah, it is cruel and unusual punishment. Like, it's basically a situation in which people that already have basically nothing and are deprived of whatever means they try to sort of create for themselves. Also, supposedly, a majority of homeless people are foster kids who aged out of the system and left with no support network. Yeah, that is a huge problem as well. That is certainly a huge problem as well. That no support networks where people are just sort of like people are just left to their own devices. Right? It is anti homeless. The US is anti homeless. But I will say that it is not a problem that is exclusive to the US. We must understand this. There's nothing special about the US in this regard. Many places in the world, this is a very universal problem, the treatment of the homeless. Like the sort of attitude towards the homeless, that since they do not own a home, since they do not own sort of the means to sustain themselves in a stable way, they don't really deserve any considerations. Barely citizens. So I am discussing sort of this problem when it comes to the US right now. But let's not make a mistake of trying to frame this as a US, as a problem that is somehow specific to the US as a country. Because that would be a mistake. That would be a mistake. It is a problem of a wider attitude towards the homeless that exists in quite a few countries, actually. I would say including Poland, by the way. For years, political leaders have chosen to tolerate encampments as an alternative to meaningfully addressing the Western region's severe housing shortage. Attorneys representing the city's homeless population wrote to the court in January arguing against taking on the appeal. Right, that's right. And I would say, of course, that it is very important to tackle the problems of housing shortage, soaring housing prices, people lacking the income to sustain themselves, to be able to afford living in an apartment or a home. It is important to tackle those systemic problems, but it is also at the same time important not to deprive the already homeless people of the only means that they have to make do, right? Like, you have to balance short term, long term. You have to marry these concepts. You cannot just think of the long term and completely ignore the short term. That is very bad policy. You have to be able to take care of both. You know, you have to be able to tackle both. It's like with, and I guess we are going back to that topic now. It's like with Ukraine. Europe needs to work on its manufacturing capability when it comes to weapons, when it comes to producing weapons, but it also needs to realize that Ukraine needs weapons and ammunition now. So while working on its production capability, Europe must also at the same time buy weapons and munitions from third party sources and send them to Ukraine now. So, by going with this analogy, the legislators must work towards finding solutions to big systemic problems such as housing shortages, people increasingly not being able to sustain themselves from their sources of income, and also not depriving the already homeless in the short term of the encampments that are basically their only, well, it's their housing, quote unquote, in this sort of situation. It is their housing. Among the leaders lobbying the court to overturn the appellate ruling is California Governor Gavin Newsom. D. In an amicus brief filed last month, Newsom, who has made fighting homelessness a marquee issue, argued that preventing municipalities from ticketing homeless people hampers law enforcement. See, it's not about fixing issues, it's about law enforcement. But do you know what? If the law does not serve the people, then it is a useless law. I'm sorry. Law is supposed to serve the people. The people are not here to serve the law. No matter how stupid it is, no matter how counterproductive it is, matter how harmful it is. That is not how that's supposed to work. Law is supposed to keep societies in order. Law is also supposed to work for us. Right? So that is a really stupid argument. It's a really empty argument. Hampers law enforcement. If a law does not work, you change the law. Laws aren't absolute, unchangeable, perfect. When a law does not work for what it's supposed to do, you change it. You change the law. Encampments are dangerous. Period. California is investing billions to build housing and provide the services needed to get people out of tents and into safer situations, Newsom said in a statement. However, our best efforts are being blocked because of sweeping injunctions that delay progress and fail to provide any consistent guidance to local authorities to abide by. I don't agree with this. This is bullshit. I need to hear some real justification for saying that the homeless creating tent encampment somehow blocks uh, the cities from building more housing and trying to get housing for the homeless. That's I don't see the logical link here. I just don't see the link here. How banning homeless people from creating those encampments also blocks the possibility of creating more housing and from directing people from those tents to that housing. It makes no sense to me. The United States Supreme Court can establish a balance that allows enforcement of reasonable limits on camping in public spaces while still respecting the dignity of those living on our streets, he continued. By setting out a clear rule, the court can empower state and local governments to enact and enforce compassionate policies that will help save lives, strengthen their communities, and ultimately work to stem the tides of this homelessness crisis. I'm sorry, you don't stem the homelessness crisis by banning people from existing in public. You stem the homelessness crisis by actually tackling the underlying issues. I'm sorry. This is ridiculous. The Justice Department has taken a similar position, advocating for the appellate decision to be overturned, while also stating that homelessness writ large should not be criminalized. The mayors of San Francisco and Phoenix and 20 Republican attorneys general from around the country also encouraged the Supreme Court to take on the case. A ruling is expected by late June. Well, now you know what we will be looking at late June. We will be taking a look at this ruling. We'll be taking a look at what the Supreme Court will deem to be the acceptable solution to this. I just don't see it. I don't see how allowing people to camp in tents blocks all solutions to the underlying problems. I don't see how it blocks more housing from being built. I don't see how it blocks the homeless from being directed from the tents to the housing. I just I just don't see it. I guess I'm too stupid to see it. I guess someone would have to explain it to me as if I were a toddler because I just don't see the link. I don't see it. Well, I suppose for now, until we get that ruling, that is it for now. I just all I can see is that it's the continuation, a continuation of an ongoing, not even policy, but an ongoing attitude towards the homeless, an unfortunate attitude towards the homeless.